Two Saudi sisters have fled home for freedom abroad. Maha and Wafa al-Subaie say they suffered domestic abuse from their family and lack of basic human rights in Saudi Arabia. The young women had planned their escape in secrecy for years before finally traveling from the kingdom to Turkey and then to the country of Jordan.
Their journey is detailed in a new article on foreignpolicy.com. It takes a closer look at these latest refugees fleeing the kingdom. Freelance journalist Laura Kasinoff wrote that article. She's reported extensively from the Middle East, and she's also the author of the memoir, Don't Be Afraid of the Bullets, an accidental war correspondent in Yemen. She joins us now from Los Angeles. Thanks for being with us, Laura.
Thanks for having me.
So you were able to find these sisters. How were you able to do that? And you also got them to tell their story by getting them to open up to you. That must have been really difficult, because whenever you're dealing with people in these sort of life or death situations, the tendency, especially if they're suspicious of outside people, is to not talk about what they've experienced.
Yeah, that's very true. So I was in Tbilisi, Georgia, reporting, actually, and it had broken in local press that these Saudi sisters had fled from Saudi to Turkey and then crossed the border and were living in Georgia. And in Georgia, they were trying to get resettled then to a third country, or a fourth country, really, a Western, sort of hopefully someplace in Europe or North America or something like that. I saw it reported in local press, and I contacted some journalists who had been in contact with them. And I was able to reach out to them that way. At that time, they were living in a refugee shelter in Georgia. And I mean, what happened was, it ended. I speak some Arabic. I worked a lot in the Middle East, so I was able sort of to create a rapport with the sisters. And the truth is that they were eager to tell their story, and they had sort of. It was a really incredible thing. I mean, their life had become so different than what their life was in Saudi. I mean, they had never been on an airplane prior to fleeing. And so I think because of sort of that big life shift that they did, they just thought, we're going to tell our story. We're going to say what happened. I mean, they were definitely very worried about family, and they always sort of checked the people who were getting in contact with them. Could they trust them? This sort of thing. They're worried that their family would come to Georgia and sort of take revenge somehow. And they were worried that the law enforcement in Georgia wasn't going to be able to protect them against that threat. And Saudis don't need visas to come to Georgia, so it's quite easy for Saudis to come there.
When I read about these two sisters, it reminded me of Rafa al-Qanun, who was the young woman who locked herself in a hotel at an airport. Eventually, she made her way to Canada. And then I thought of sort of all the other women who were driving and uploading, themselves driving on Instagram, and the ways in which Saudi women have been speaking out more and more. But I'm curious about when you see this happening, here in the U.S., when you see somebody driving on Instagram, you think, oh, I guess they're able to do that without facing tremendous risk. Can you just give us an idea of what sort of risks these women are taking when they decide to speak out, when they decide to plan an escape, when they decide to get in the car and drive and video themselves doing it?
Yeah, I mean, that's really an incredible part of the story, is the risks that the al-Subaie sisters took, because if they were caught at any point along the way and their family suspected that they were trying to escape, I mean, they could have been greatly abused, and they could have possibly even been killed. And I think, one of the issues that they were fleeing from is the fact that they felt there wasn't a state that could protect them with the threat of that violence against them. And I mean, they were afraid to go to the police in the years of their alleged, domestic abuse at the hands of their family. So there is the great risk of when they actually flee. I mean, it's really incredible that they do it, because if they get caught, they can be killed, and they're afraid they're going to be killed with impunity. And then the other issue is that some of the activists within Saudi Arabia, and particularly the activists who helped push for the driving ban to be lifted, a handful of them are in prison and and there's been reports of solitary confinement, abuse, and those things in prison. So yes, Saudi women can drive now. I mean, that has changed, and that is happening, and they're not going to be arrested for driving. I mean, they can take Instagram videos of themselves driving, and that's happening. The thing is that it's still really only women from more liberal families who were able to do things like that. Like, things are opening there, but it's the family that can control whether or not women can take part in these new freedoms. And part of that reason is because of the guardianship law, which is an actual law in Saudi Arabia. And then the other part is just custom. So a lot of families haven't caught up with these new and evolving and changing laws. And so, like the al-Subaie sisters, they just felt that they were never going to be able to take part in the new freedoms, and they had no other hope. And I thought that was really incredible, that they thought that there was no future for them in Saudi.
Laura, it's so fascinating to me, the coverage of Saudi Arabia, how it's shifted over the last couple of years. A couple of years ago, when the Crown Prince came into power, he became more well known. There were articles after article and news story after news story reporting on what kind of a reformer he was. And I just recall myself thinking to myself, what I knew about the kingdom was that it was a repressive monarchy, where the rule of law is established by the monarchy, by the king or the crown prince, and that's it. The human rights record of that country is abysmal. Now, in the wake of the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, that narrative has started to shift. People see the crown prince and the entire kingdom and the entire family for what they are. But you write in your article a quote from the sister saying that if you call the police don't even come into the house. They won't help us. And so I want you to paint for our viewers a picture of life for women in general in Saudi Arabia, because they weren't just leaving, they weren't just leaving their situation. They wanted to get the heck away from the kingdom.
And just to sort of piggyback on what you said, Vlad, you said that they felt like they could even be killed. And I was curious, is it that the law says, it's okay to kill a woman who tries to do this, or is it what Vlad described in your article, that the administration of justice, no matter what it says on a piece of paper, the administration of justice does not lean in the favor of women?
I mean, I think it's very much so what you said, Anne-Marie. Like, the law on paper might not be the law that's actually going to be what is carried out. Women can get jobs, for example, without the permission of their family, but many employers aren't going to hire a woman without the permission of her family, and there's nothing really the woman can do, to fight that. So it is quite tricky, because I think that when you say what is the situation for women in Saudi Arabia, there's a lot of different situations. It's not just one monolithic thing. However, for women from conservative families, they do feel like that the issue is that there's no law to help them. And there's no law that's going to sort of, if they're being abused, if they want to take part in new freedoms, this sort of thing, there's nothing that's going to sort of punish their family for not letting them do that. I mean, the other thing is that the guardianship law is still in place. So the guardianship law is the law that requires women to have permission from their families for certain things, like any sort of higher education, to travel internationally, to get a passport. So what happened actually with the al-Subaie sisters is they sort of snuck onto their dad's accounts on the Saudi app that, like, the women's guardian can mark them as having permission to travel internationally. And they marked themselves as having permission to travel internationally, hoping and praying that their dad wasn't going to see it. By the time they did that, and they fled the country. So that is another incredible part of the story, that they took that risk. So that, there's things like that. There's basic freedoms like that that women are totally reliant on their families for. And then there's the issue that the law doesn't work in their favor, as you said.
Wow, it's really fascinating, and it's an interesting story to tell. I think we're going to hear more stories like this, because it feels like once a journalist hangs on to one story and sort of shines a light on it, you hear about other women, other women sort of trying to figure out their own sort of escape routes. Laura Kasinoff, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me.